My name is James J. Cummings. I'm a neonatologist in upstate New York. I was asked to speak to you today about a clinical report that our committee in the AAP recently published on oxygen targeting in extremely low birth weight infants, specifically in regards to recently completed prospective clinical trials of oxygen saturation targeting. This is our clinical report, which was published in August of 2016. The conclusions in our clinical report are summarized here. Briefly, we concluded that oxygen saturation targeting has both clinical and practical considerations, that an ideal oxygen saturation target range remains an elusive goal, and that fairly wide alarm limits with an upper alarm limit around 95% are reasonable. Although our report was published in August of 2016, the final draft was completed almost a year prior. Since then, there have been numerous publications, primarily from the NICUprom trials. So one might ask, is it now time to revise our AAP clinical report? I would suggest that the answer is likely to be no, at least not yet. So why do I say that? Well, the results from NICUprom support the notion that targeting an SpO2 range of 91 to 95% is preferable to targeting a range of 85 to 89%. But what about other target ranges, including those with a lower limit in the 80s? It's hard to know, because study infants spend most of their time outside their assigned target ranges. As a result, separation between study groups was modest, and overlap between groups was significant. This is illustrated in this figure, which I created from published data from the Boost 2 trials, although I think it is representative of all the NICUprom trials. I plotted various SpO2 ranges with the time actually spent within those ranges for the two study groups, with the lower saturation target group shown in blue and the higher saturation target group shown in red. There are several things worth noting here. Ideally, we would have liked to see just two columns, one blue column in the 85 to 89% range, and one red column in the 91 to 95% range, with each at 100% time spent within those respective ranges. But what we see is a wide spread in saturations, extensive overlap between study groups, and significant time spent with extreme saturations. We also note that being in the lower group significantly increases the time spent with saturations below 85%, while being in the higher group significantly increases the time spent with saturations above 95%. An analogy would be like trying to drive within lane markers on a highway. If your lane is wide, you have no trouble keeping in target, but if your lanes are narrow, you're more likely to stray outside target. For infants in the lower saturation target range, this increases the risk of hypoxemia, while for infants in the higher saturation target range, this increases the risk of hyperoxia. Now let's turn to the major outcomes in the NICUprom trials. Here is a composite figure showing all 5 trials pooled together, and also broken down into 2 subgroups based on the pulse oximeter algorithm used to monitor the infants. The composite primary outcome of death or disability is represented by the height of each column. Within each column, the lower portion shows the proportion of infants who died, and the upper portion shows the proportion of infants who survived with disability. There are 2 things I want to point out here. First, the primary outcome was no different in the overall study, although the secondary outcome of death was significantly different. Second, this significant difference in mortality is driven primarily from the revised algorithm subset. This subset represents about 1/3 of all the patients in NICUprom and included 2 trials that were stopped early following an interim look at mortality differences. In the much larger subset of 3,000 infants studied using the original pulse oximeter software, there were no differences between study groups in either the primary composite outcome or the secondary component outcomes of death and disability. These results raise additional questions. For example, how do we account for bias when a trial is stopped early based on an interim analysis? How do we explain the dramatic change in treatment effect after introducing the revised algorithm? And what is the physiologic basis for an increased mortality in the lower saturation group? The issue of oxygen targeting was recently addressed by a European panel of experts. Although they recommended targeting saturation rates between 90 and 94%, they also noted that the quality of evidence for this recommendation was moderate, not high, and that their recommendation was therefore weak. Whether this weak recommendation changes clinical practice remains to be seen. In a recent survey of European NICUs, 193 NICUs from 27 countries responded to the following question. In your NICU, in what range do you try to maintain oxygen saturations for infants born at less than or equal to 28 weeks of gestation who are receiving oxygen therapy? Shown here are the responses to that question in the form of a frequency cloud, where the size of the text corresponds to the relative frequencies of a particular response. 40 different saturation ranges were reported, from the lowest range of 82 to 93% to the highest range of 94 to 99%. Although 90 to 95% was the most frequently reported oxygen saturation target, this represented only 28% of units. Many units reported using wider ranges, and more than half the units used lower limits below 90%. In order to inform clinical practice, we need to examine individual patient saturation data in NEOPROM, not just target group assignment, in terms of clinical outcomes. Although such analyses can be challenging, they will not only help us better understand the relationship between peripheral oxygen saturation and clinical outcomes, but also the individual patient factors that may modulate those effects. Until then, uncertainty will remain and variations in practice will continue. Thank you.